Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to the organisers for putting together this event this evening. It's a real thrill for all of us. It's a real thrill for me to be here with Siegfried Ramler, who has asked me to call him Sig rather than Siegfried. I should mention in a moment how I got to come across him. My own world is very much connected to that of simultaneous interpretation. I act as a barrister in front of many different international courts and tribunals. And we have come to really appreciate and recognize the fundamental role that is played by high quality interpretation that is reliable, that is independent, and that is completely professional. And I have to say, in my own experience, the quality of the simultaneous interpretation at the courts that I've appeared before, many of whose are members of this association, has been extraordinary. We do, I have to say, as barristers, sometimes like to tweak the interpreters. We get to know them very, very well over the course of the years, and so we constantly have little games of putting things into our speeches that catch them unawares. And the classic one, of course, at the International Court of Justice is you throw in an expression like, that's a real red herring of an argument. And trying to translate that into French does always cause some difficulty. The upshot of how we got here and to be with Siegfried Ramler, and I'll introduce him in a moment, was that I was asked by the association to deliver a lecture on the occasion of this event, which marks also the approaching 70th anniversary of the Nuremberg trial. And the context was that the association had prepared a poster show highlighting the role played by a number of remarkable individuals. You've heard about 3 of them who were interpreters during the Nuremberg process. And they sent me, I think, a package of little biographies of about 26 of the interpreters, many of whom had remarkable lives. You'll have seen, some of them had remarkable children. I was amazed that one of the interpreters had a daughter called Simone Signoret, who was indeed the actress. But me being me, I got the list of 26 names and thought it would be interesting to see if any of them were around to have a conversation with. And the reason for that was that I was finishing a book which focused on the Nuremberg trial and the interweaving lives of 2 of the prosecutors, Hirsch Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin, and a man called Hans Frank, who you're going to hear about tonight in a little more detail. And so I'd read myself into Hans Frank, thank you very much, and was interested to know whether anyone had interpreted Hans Frank. So I went through the list of, I think it was about 26 interpreters, and finally came across the name of Siegfried Ramler, who I saw was active, engaged, approaching his 90th birthday. This was just a few months ago. And I found a phone number in Honolulu, Hawaii, and I called it, and he picked up the telephone. And we started having a conversation. And I was astonished to learn that not only had Siegfried Ramler interpreted during the trial process, the famous trial, but in the weeks before the trial, which began on the 20th of November 1945, in late August, September, and the first week of October, there were a series of interrogations which took place. And those interrogations involved an interrogator and an interpreter. And amazingly for me, the interpreter in on the Hans Frank interrogations was none other than Siegfried Ramler. So I'd come across someone that I thought this could never happen, I could not imagine, talking and having a conversation with someone who had sat probably at the distance we are sitting and had looked into Hans Frank's eyes and listened to what Hans Frank had said. As you know, Hans Frank was the Governor General of occupied Poland. He had been Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer from 1928, and he was charged with crimes against humanity and genocide, and he was hanged on the 16th of October 1946 for crimes against humanity and war crimes, and for murdering 3 million Poles and Jews. So it's an individual, when you speak to Siegfried, you feel you are connected to people who've been close to history. And of course, as we're going to hear, it's not the only person that you were with. Now, your life didn't begin in Nuremberg. Your life began in Vienna. Tell us a little bit about the trail to London and then Nuremberg.
Well, first of all, let me just say that I'm very happy to be here with you. And I'm also very touched by the enthusiasm shown by previous speakers about this organization, about the challenges that you're facing. It's a long journey to come here from Honolulu to London, including about 10 or 11 hours from Seattle to London. But I don't regret having done it at all. It's really nice to be here with you. Let me just add just a few autobiographical comments. Philippe told you about my work during the pre-trial interrogations. When I'm asked about the significance of the Nuremberg trials, of the Nuremberg events, I often talk about the pre-trial interrogations. Why do I do that? Because this was history in the raw. It was the very first time that the leaders of a nation were given an opportunity and were asked to articulate their positions, the kinds of things that happened while they were there. So this meant that the pre-trial interrogations were in a way can be compared to a physician who conducts an autopsy. You find out where the malignancy is, and you talk about that. This was consecutive interpreting during the pre-trial phase. But we had a great challenge before us. Your previous speaker talked about Léon d'Auster, who by Justice Jackson, who was a member of the Supreme Court of the United States and was given leave of absence from the Supreme Court by President Truman to come to Nuremberg as chief prosecutor at the time. So this found me in London. At that time, as was mentioned, I came to England first on the Kindertransport in December of 1938. I was all of 14 years old, and continued my studies, and also did some war work. So I spent some very interesting and intensive times in London at that period. Well, if I should then jump over to my role at Nuremberg, the challenge before us was...
Just before you get there, because it's an interesting story on how did a 22-year-old end up being an interpreter at Nuremberg.
Well, I was just coming to that. The war was just ending. It was ending in 1945. The Second World War was ending. And the situation on the European continent was chaotic. I was still in London. I lived in London throughout the Blitz. I also had a relative in London at that time. But when we now came to the preparation of a trial, after all the discussions that took place with the Soviet Union representatives, the British, the French, and the American, within an incredibly short time, when I say a short time, I mean only several months, it was possible to bring together an indictment, and a key need was the personnel, the kinds of people who would take on the role of interpreters. I was all of 22 years old, and I must say I would not have employed myself at that age. This then presented the challenge how to deal with 4 languages in a trial with English, German, French, and Russian. And how would it be? It could not be done easily, and it would be terribly boring to consecutively go into various languages. I mean, it was just impossible to visualize how it could be done in that way. So something else needed to be created. And this leads me to the visionary of Léon d'Auster and others who came up with the notion of a simultaneous system. And lo and behold, it worked, and we were able to bring together teams of interpreters who would be using that system. And it was difficult, there were mistakes made, but we overcame the difficulties, and therefore, in a way, were the pioneers of a system that is still very important and very active today. There's hardly any international conference or legal conference of any sort that does not employ that approach at that time. So in my case, I responded to a call for linguists to help in Germany with issues relating to disarmament, with issues relating to logistics, with issues relating to the provision of US and British and other forces as they were advancing into Germany at that time. But as I said, I was very young. I was 22 years old, and I was sort of adapted by a battalion of much older soldiers and airmen, and helped them in a great deal in crossing that language bridge. Here I could have been, in some cases, the son of any of the people who I was working with at the time. And so this gives a little bit of a background how I got to Nuremberg. Why? Because this battalion that I was attached to was a mobile battalion, and we were moving from place to place. One of the places we moved to was Erlangen, which is a university town in Germany. I went to Erlangen for an interview, but then I went to the Nuremberg Palace of Justice and introduced myself, and was welcomed, I should say, with open arms. They said, we need people like you. We need linguists who could help us, and here I am. So I returned to my base where my battalion was located, and I approached the commander, a regular army colonel, and told him that at Nuremberg there were plans undergoing for an international trial, that I was needed there, and would I be given permission, to leave the battalion and work with that very important group at Nuremberg. That colonel said to me, "Nothing doing. We need you here." He did not give me any permission, saying you have to stay with us in the battalion. Did not give me any permission, to join the Secretariat General and the beginning staff. At that point in my life, I made a decision that really changed my life, and I would not be sitting here in front of you if I hadn't done something in retrospect would seem fairly insignificant, but yet extremely fateful and extremely important. Because a week or so later, I heard that decision by the colonel. There's nothing I could do about it. But about a week or 2 weeks later, I received orders to go to an air base in Frankfurt and be relieved of my duties in that Nuremberg area and return to London at that time. Now I realized that if I went on that plane going back to London, I would never be able to make contact with the battalion. The situation in Germany was chaotic right at the end of the war, but my decision was not to get on that aeroplane, in a sense legally, to become what is called AWOL, A-W-O-L, that meaning absent without leave, because I did not follow the orders to get on the plane. But then immediately after that, I didn't have even time to think about it. I was submerged in work from early morning, often at 7 or 8 in the morning, until late in the evening, doing the pre-trial interrogations that we've been talking about
Can I ask, so you arrive in Nuremberg, how organized is it? Was it complete mayhem? Did you get any training?
There was no training for me as a linguist, as an interpreter. I spoke, I was good material, if you wish, as an interpreter, because my most recent experience in language was English. I was a student, I did part-time work and so on. So I became fluent. Then I was an avid reader, and I was reading P.G. Wodehouse, books like that. And so I was completely submerged in an English-speaking atmosphere, which trained me very well to take on a position of English speakers at the trial. But at the same time, alongside with English, there was die Muttersprache, which means the mother language. So on the one hand, I was born with as everyone is, with a Muttersprache. On the other hand, I had the acquisition of a very fluent and very active English, so that put me into a role of being well suited to do the kind of job I was doing. So now you may wonder, how did this story end? Here was this young fellow, 22 years, who went AWOL, and what's going to happen to him?
We're going to come to that, but just before, I want to keep them on tenterhooks.
Right.
Just before we get that, if we can just go back in time, because there's another aspect of your life that is relevant here, at least from an outsider's perspective. You were 14 years old in March 1938 when the Anschluss happened. You were there when the German Wehrmacht marched into Vienna. You saw the swastikas, you saw the reaction. So you're bringing to this trial process a childhood memory. How did that impact on your sense of being? I mean, Baldur von Schirach was now a defendant, but in March 1938 he was the governor of Austria.
Oh, that's right.
So how did you feel personally finding yourself after the triumphant arrival of the Germans into Vienna and Austria, now being in a trial with these very same people?
Yeah. Well, it touched me quite directly, because this was coincided with an event that many of you, I think you're not old enough to have actually directly experienced it, but that was the Kristallnacht, the night of broken glasses, of broken crystal. There was a German diplomat in Paris was shot by a young Polish Jewish boy who was upset about the treatment that his parents were given, and that enraged Hitler. Was at that time in Munich, and was absolutely enraged by the fact that a German diplomat would be killed by a Pole in Paris. And while he was still at this event, Hitler was at the event in Munich, he decreed, along with others with him, that this would be an open invitation to set on fire synagogues, to smash windows of apartment buildings and flats and so on. And this went on for several days. It's very interesting, because Goering, although he was involved in those things, also in a conference said, you know, Hitler, Herr Führer, you ordered all of that, and windows were smashed. There was indeed a Kristallnacht, but insurance was still in force, and in the long run, some of the people who were affected would be compensated through insurance policy, which is sort of amusing when you think of that combination. So, as a quick answer to your question, of course, I remember, for example, being in our apartment in Vienna at the time, with the curtains drawn, looking down to the street and watching SS men and SA men marching in rhythm, and I kept keeping the curtains closed and being worried of what would happen to my family. Well, fortunately, the SS did not enter the house, and we were very fortunate that they passed by. But this experience is only one of many similar type of cumulative experiences that we lived through in Vienna at the time. And this is when the opportunity came to join a Kindertransport. My parents were very anxious, as you can imagine, to get me out of Austria and arranged that possibility to join the Kindertransport, where a law was passed in England to allow 10,000 children from Austria, from Germany, from Czechoslovakia to go out. And that was in December 1938. The war, the attack on Poland started just a few years right after that, and the borders were all closed. In other words, if I had not taken advantage of my parents, had not tried to get me out, I would have been one of those hundreds and thousands of children who were gathered and sent to be exterminated and gassed in Auschwitz and many other camps like that. So the cumulative experience was very powerful. If you can imagine a 22-year-old boy living through this kind of an experience.
Which raises the question, then you find yourself just 6 or 7 years later in a formal legal process in which you are required to be independent, impartial, unemotional, to translate and interpret, or to interpret faithfully and honestly. When you arrived, did you have concerns about your ability to do that in an abstract sense?
No, I didn't, and I didn't analyze my work in that way at all. I was preoccupied with doing a good job, having a difficult task, a task that was very challenging, that required dealing with unusual vocabulary, with many linguistic situations for which I was not prepared, and yet saying, I have to do it, working with colleagues who were helpful to me, we were able, to bridge that gap that had to be bridged. So if I just make a quick leap forward, and then we might come back to some of the more specific things dealing with interpreting. At the moment, I'm still active professionally, and I'm a senior fellow at an international institute, East-West Center in Hawaii, where my focus for the past 15 or 20 years ago has been on especially East Asia, Japan, and the People's Republic of, more intensively in the last 10 years with the PRC, with the People's Republic of China, working in a cooperative way with the Ministry of Education in Beijing, in Peking, and giving me opportunities and requirements to be in China virtually once a year, in organizing opportunities in two ways: for Chinese scholars to be invited to come to the United States and get an in-depth look and understanding of the United States, for Chinese scholars going to the US, and then for US scholars having a similar type of program to go to China, beginning in Beijing and going to different parts. And I was, in a sense, both a leader and administrator of that kind of two-way relationship between China and the United States, and particularly Hawaii. But as Philippe said, I'll be 90 years old in October, and I think it's time to hang up my hat, although I don't actually wear a hat. It's just an idiom.
Before you do that, let's go back in time. Let's go back. If we go to the next one, yeah.
Yeah, let me explain that picture too.
Well, we'll come back to the picture in a
Okay.
minute, because I want to start with. I want to go forward to the next one. That's it. So I want to go forward to the 7th of September, 1945. What you have on the screen is the document marked secret, testimony of Hans Frank, taken in Nuremberg, Germany from 10:30 to 12:15 hours by Thomas S. Hinkle, Lieutenant Colonel Interrogator. Interpreter, Siegfried Ramler, that's you, and then the reporter, Mr. Kerry. And then the first question is to you: what is your name? Siegfried Ramler. What is your present duty? I am an interpreter. Question: do you solemnly swear you will interpret my questions from English into German and the responses of the witnesses from German into English truly and correctly to the best of your ability? So help you God. I do. Now, you then find yourself in the room with this individual. Let's just put his image up just to remind you. This is Hans Frank. And you find yourself in a room, a small room. You go into that room. You are 22 years old. You're interpreting a man who is alleged, he's innocent at that point, he's not been convicted, of having murdered 3 million individuals. How do you feel when you go into that room for the first time?
Well, as I mentioned before, for me, the predominant question really was not a feeling, but it was a linguistic question. How do I challenge, how do I accept this kind of a challenge to deal with linguistically with what I had to do? And this was a situation also when we talk about Hans Frank. Well, let me explain first. You may wonder what this young man encircled there is doing, sitting in a tier just below the judges. Above me were the 8 judges, the main judge and associate judge of Great Britain, great Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, Chief Justice Lawrence, was a very fine leader of the judges group. And then there were the French judges and the Russian judges and the British judges at that time. So I'm just trying to explain to you why I was sitting there at those particular moments.
That was in the trial. That came after the interrogation.
It came after the interrogation. It was already in the trial.
If we could just start with the interrogation,
yes.
And then we'll come and you can talk at length on the trial. But on the interrogation, it's different from the trial. It wasn't simultaneous.
It was not simultaneous. It was a pre-trial interrogation.
So the question was asked in English.
In English, and interpreted into German.
And you interpreted it into German.
German, right.
And as you were interpreting it into German, what is your position? Are you looking at Hans Frank straight in the eye? Is he looking at you in the eye? We all know from conversations we have, there's that connection, that human connection that is made. How was that process?
Yeah, I'm not really conscious of any particular process about looking into one another's eyes. I think that looking into eyes in that situation was very similar to any two people meeting and talking to one another and looking at one another as the conversation developed. But the reason I was there was one of several tasks I had in Nuremberg, not only in simultaneous interpreting and so on, but in this particular task, I had the important role, although it doesn't maybe seem that important as I explain it, of helping the court reporters prepare their daily transcript of what had gone on during the trials. As you can imagine, during the pre-trial interrogation and also during the trial itself, there were a great many place names needed, place names in Germany or in Europe. There were names of individuals mentioned there, again, very importantly, place names, ranks. And so all of these are proper nouns, proper words that the American court reporters would be unable to decipher and to prepare the transcript. So at certain times, I had the duty to be seated in a row right beneath the judges, and the interpreters, especially the American interpreters, would come into the courtroom, would take their seats, and would take either stenotype of stenography for about half an hour, and then go to their offices to transcribe. And they needed as they were leaving the courtroom, I would give them a sheet of paper where all the place names were spelled out, the names of individuals were spelled out, and all of that, so that the reporters could go back to their offices and type up the transcript. What is, in retrospect, an amazing feat is at the end of a trial day, a transcript was ready in 4 languages, in English, French, Russian, and German. Now, it was not polished language. There was no time to, to really polish and edit it, but it was strong enough to avoid big mistakes. And after all, it was a trial of life and death, and it was very important to go through that review process.
And in the process of correction, for example, not in the trial, but in the pre-trial interrogations, the people you were there for the interrogation for, did they sometimes correct the interpretations that you made?
Yes, they did from time to time. Let me give you a typical correction that may ring a bell. The German leadership used the German from time to time that we almost jokingly called Nazi German. What kind of German was that was labeled as Nazi, National Socialist German? It was a way of not spelling out some of the criminal activities which would have shocked not only the Germans, all the Europeans and the whole world. So what happened is terms like Endlösung, final solution, would come up. So when the term Endlösung came up, everybody in that room knew that meant killing and extermination. But the term Endlösung, in and of itself, is innocuous.
How did you interpret it when the term...
it was final solution, and the term final solution had to be interpreted in that way. But to answer your question more precisely, to give you an example, I was on the microphone and I was translating into English a situation where some of the populations of Galicia in Poland was seized and transported further to the east. Now I now use the term seized. Seized has an aggressive connotation, and that is where I used seized. But at the same time, that verb erfassen can also be translated as registered. That population was registered. Registered is an innocuous term, has nothing to do with killing anyone or murder, but I was in the curious position, and again there's almost a humorous aspect to it, that when this matter came up with a seized or registered, the German Defense Council said this term was used seized and it should be erfassen, it should be registered. And there was a back and forth between the prosecution and back until finally Sir Justice Lawrence, the Chief Justice, did something that is typical of judges to do, and saying is, we'll let us finish this discussion now. The tribunal will take these matters into consideration when the time comes, which is a typical judicial approach to some issues like that. Now Philippe would know more about that.
But that's very interesting. So did you as a group of interpreters then try to reach agreement amongst yourselves, for example, on the word Erfassung or Endlösung, and agree amongst yourselves how you were going to interpret it, or were you each individually coming to your own view as to how it should be interpreted?
It was the latter, because in my case, saying is, I as an interpreter felt that I was responding to the context in which that word is used. And if I felt that context was appropriate, I would interpret it in that appropriate manner. But in answer to your question, yes, indeed, I had to come to that decision in a split second, so to speak.
So taking that forward and just testing it out, because it's interesting, there are many people in the room who are interpreters and who've lived through this experience. You've got what a lawyer might call a discretion. You can go this way, you can go that way. To what extent does your personal feeling towards the defendant, let us say, where you're sitting with someone like Goering, who you spent time with, or Hans Frank, and you might, even very subconsciously, or perhaps not subconsciously, have very negative feelings towards this individual, give an interpretation that is either less helpful or more helpful?
Yeah. Well, we realize from time to time that we made mistakes, and that those mistakes needed to be recognized, and that related often to conversations that we had among interpreters.
And you would try to sort it out. But even amongst the interpreters, there were disagreements.
There could have been disagreements.
Yeah. Because you told me on another occasion when we had a conversation that amongst the people who were observing the trial, there were strongly negative feelings towards some of the defendants. So you mentioned to me Julius Streicher was someone whom no one in the trial wanted to be close to, shall we say.
It's very important to recognize that the defendant's stock of 21 individuals, defendants, was a diverse group. If you read about the trials itself, I mean, there's a lot of information that has been written about the characteristics of the defendants. Now take an individual like Julius Streicher, a virulent anti-Semite. He published I don't want to use the term rag here because the rag is something positive, but it was a rag in a negative sense at that particular time. I don't know where I stopped my train of thought.
But in terms of Julius Streicher, you were about to tell it. Yeah.
Well, none of the defendants would have anything to do with him. They wouldn't speak to him. He was a pariah. He was isolated in the defendant's stock. He didn't really have any friends. Maybe the closest one that he might have had was Kaltenbrunner, but it's really hard to say. But if you analyze the characteristics of the defendant's stock, you had the military group, you had the military leadership, Army, Navy, Air Force, and so, which played a role, and they formed a sort of a unit, and they related to each other. Give you an example of the role of the top military leaders played at the time. It became very obvious when the Eastern Front opened up in addition to the Western Front that was not a defensible position for Germany to take, to fight simultaneously on two fronts at the same time. And it was especially clear to the military leadership. After all, there were hundreds of thousands of soldiers and their lives were at stake if such strategic mistakes were made. Well, during the pre-trial interrogations, people like Keitel and Jodl, like the top military leaders, would say that they would all agree that some of the decisions that Adolf Hitler made were really terrible, would cause not only defeat on the battlefield, but in lives and so on, that something had to be done. And they agreed at saying that, I don't know whether it was Keitel or Jodl, that they would go in to see Hitler in Berchtesgaden or wherever he happened to be, and confront Hitler with these kind of fundamental strategic mistakes. And they said this, and this not only once, the response came up several times. And the response was, speaking like Keitel, I went in to see the Führer. I was all ready to confront him with some of the opinions of the military leadership. But when I was in his presence, when I was in Adolf Hitler's presence, it was impossible for me to raise any objection. Raising an objection would have meant treason against Germany. So I could not do it, and none of the other leaders could do that. And this is something that was a pattern during the trial.
Yeah. I want to ask 2 or 3 more questions and then throw it open to the audience, because I'm sure you have questions. I'd like to go just to the next.
Just before you go on with that, some of these comments are also in my book, in my autobiography.
I meant to say right at the outset, but I was certainly going to say at the end, Siegfried has very, very kindly brought over a number of copies of his book. Most of them, I suspect, have already sold, but there may be a few. Have they all? They're all sold out. Okay, I'm very sorry about that. But what he has arranged to do is there will be a piece of paper at the back on which you can put your name and your email and order a copy, and they will be then signed and sent to you from Honolulu or via Amazon or some means. So please feel free to do that at the end when we break. But I want to follow up from some of these individual conversations. I want to take you to a text which is a translation into English of a part of the interrogation of Hans Frank, in which you were involved. And what I'm interested in, of course, is when you've described to me privately in our conversations, you knew when Frank was lying, or you knew when he was telling the truth or not, or you had a sense. I just want to read through, for those who are at the back, you won't be able to see it, I'm just going to read what is said so that you can get a sense of what Hans Frank, Governor General of occupied Poland, claimed at this date in September 1945 in the presence of Siegfried in relation to what he knew and didn't know. All these interrogation transcripts are publicly available. We can make them available to you by email very, very easily. And the strategy of Frank is to pass the buck onto the SS. And so what he says is, the SS never allowed any of my workers to get involved in their Jewish campaigns. At first they started to gather together the Jews, saying that anyway the Jews had their own parts of the town in every town they lived, and it was then we tried through the formation of ghettos to keep things in order, at least in the bigger cities. In these ghettos, all Jews were to be rounded up together. They were to be under the protection of the police. They were to have their own administration there. I want to point out that the order we talked about yesterday about the forced labor of Jews, that those orders had actually never gone into effect, that the SS acted under their own orders and declared that the general governor had nothing to order. Question: what happened to the Jews? Answer: we already talked about that today, that these ghettos came into their greatest difficulties, especially Warsaw, where food was concerned. And then in accordance with the plan, the general transportation of Jews towards the east was carried out. Question: what was your participation in that? Answer: I fought against that until the very last moment. So the court didn't buy that argument. You're sitting there listening to him make that argument. I know you've said to me and to others, your job is just to interpret, but you're listening to material that is so extraordinary and so terrible. Is there another part of your brain that is thinking, this guy is telling the truth, this guy is lying, or is that not happening?
But actually we were not dealing with this kind of judgment. As powerful and as strong as that judgment is, as you've articulated it now, this was not our concern. The concern was to render a translation as accurately as we possibly could, and not to argue whether that was truthfully or not truthful.
But internally, not arguing, you're sitting there, you're listening to this man saying these things. Are you, as an interpreter, able to completely cut out your own personal reaction to what you're hearing?
We can't say cut out, but they were not as important as you now try to make them be, because we're not dealing with. We're not at the stage now where we're justifying a sentence, whether he would get a life sentence of 20 years and so on. We're just dealing with the language aspects. But when you think about Frank, you've seen my work on the translation with him. He belonged to a category of defendants in the main trial. He was not the only one. Frank was one. Another one who comes to mind, and I'll describe in a moment what unites them in a way, was Albert Speer, the architect and the Minister of Armament. We talked about Frank. We talked about the youth minister and leader in Austria, Baldur von Schirach. These are three examples of defendants who said essentially very similar things. When they were shown films of gas chambers and exterminations and all of the unspeakable cruelties that were going on, then when the lights went on in the courtroom, and then later on when reactions were expressed among the defendants themselves in speaking to each other, Hans Frank was one of them, and Speer another, who would say something like this: if those things were done in the name of Germany, then Germany is guilty. In other words, they said, they pronounced what one might call a collective guilt. If those things happened and we saw that they happened, then Germany indeed is guilty. But those very same people, including Frank and others, would not accept individual guilt. Let's make that distinction between collective guilt and individual guilt. Collectively, yes, Germany as a whole is guilty. Individually, no, I wasn't conscious what I was signing when I was signing a document and so on. So I think in that way, Frank fits into a group like that.
You sat through. I wonder if we could go back to that first photograph where you're sitting in on the trial now. This is you now. This is the photograph that you described before. The judges are behind you,
Yes.
and
Yes.
this is in the main trial. So you had the defendants are right in front of you. You're looking straight ahead at them
Exactly.
in the organisation of this courtroom. You saw some of the cross-examinations, for example. You were telling me about the failed cross-examination by of Goering. Could you say how did you experience that as a young interpreter?
Well, I wasn't judgmental, and we were told you're not in a role of expressing judgment. You're not to be judgmental about these things. You're an interpreter. In a sense, you're a very highly qualified technician, but you're not beyond that.
But you observed what happened.
Absolutely.
And you've described to me, maybe you could share with this group how it was to see Jackson perform a less than adequate cross-examination of Hermann Goering and then have David Maxwell Fyfe clean up the mess.
Right. Well, if you look at that photograph, as I look at myself, it's almost like looking at not at myself, but as someone else. I was young, I was 22 years old, and yet if you look at my face, and if you look at the expressions on my face, it does say something. It says something that is akin to intensive interest. I mean, I was involved in what was going on, and the movement of my head, the way that the eyes are focused and sharp at something ahead of me, all of that indicates a strong, intensive interest at that age, which may be unusual when you think of it in its entirety.
You found it a fascinating experience.
Absolutely.
And were there particular moments that stand out in your memory?
Well, again, I just mentioned when Hans Frank said what he did about the guilt of Germany. I think that was very important.
Looking back on the totality of the experience, what do you see as the legacy?
The legacy is extremely important. No, we're just sitting here and we're talking about this subject. We're talking about Germany. We're talking about the Nazi period of the 1920s, 1930s, the takeover by Hitler. And then we come to World War II, and we come to all of the atrocities that were committed. And then we ask ourselves, how is it possible that these things happened in a country that produced musicians of great talent, of a country that produced a Goethe and a Schiller of great literary talents, a country that produced paintings and artists? How is it possible that a culture like that could sink into this abyss into which they had fallen under the Nazi period? And I asked myself that question, and in my book I attempt a response, and the response briefly is just this: when you're living in a society when there are no checks on behavior, that there's no check in the way policies are enacted, when you're in a situation when there's no acceptance of any rule of law, that even some of the laws that were promulgated by Germany at one point were negated by another point. In other words, the answer to that question is, how is it possible? I would answer, yes, indeed it's possible. If there's no global rule of law, but there's no respect for legal procedure, then those things could happen in any country. In other words, it's not only a German problem, it's a human problem. And we need to think about things of that sort as a human issue, rather than isolating it and then pointing at one country alone.
Well, that's a good moment perhaps to throw it open to the audience for any questions or any comment. We've got a roving mic. If you could keep your questions as tight as possible so we can get as many as possible, but over to you in the audience to ask Siegfried Ramler whatever you would like to ask. And perhaps if you could introduce yourself just so that Sig knows who you are, that would be very helpful. And perhaps stand up so that we here can see. Thank you very much. If you could just introduce yourself, that would be terrific.
Yes, my name is Graciela Luso. I'm a freelance interpreter based in Paris. And my question is, did ever the interrogators ask you for your personal impression regarding the answers given by the defendant? If you thought he was telling the truth, or what was your personal impression, apart from what was your interpretation? Thank you.
Actually, the interrogators did not enter into any discussions at all about, whether the defendant was lying or not lying. And again, that was not our job. That was not our position. So, in a sense, when you think about it, it would have been inappropriate. And I'm not sure exactly how Philippe would interpret it. To what extent it is inappropriate for a court reporter or an interpreter and an interrogator to be discussing the nature of the testimony that was given and how believable it was and how unbelievable it was.
But interestingly, just following up from that, perhaps not in the booth, in the interrogation booth, but you've told me that life went on in Nuremberg. You were there for you were there for 4 years. There were parties, there were cocktails, there were dinners while all these terrible things were being unleashed. You told me you went to parties at the Grand Hotel. So you're sitting, talking, having a beer, having a schnapps. People talk. In that context, in answer to that question, you might meet someone who you'd been in an interrogation booth. Yeah. Would you not exchange in that context informally reactions to what you'd heard?
Well, things happened in various ways. It doesn't quite reach your argument, the way you articulate it. But let's take the Soviet Union, for example. At the Grand Hotel was the watering hole, the watering spot at the end of a busy day in the courtroom and interpreting. Then not only the Americans, the British and the Soviets, they all gathered at the Grand Hotel. The bar was very active. There was an orchestra playing and people were dancing. And here you had these unspeakable atrocities that were going on and were the subject of the trial. And then you had life at the Grand Hotel. Well, life goes on, and this is what happened. Now, what happens if it went too far? Like the Russian soldiers or the Russian officers who were at the Grand Hotel, and this happened quite frequently, went too far in their imbibing of alcohol. And what happened is, they would get drunk several times, and then when the nth time, whoever was in charge of the Soviets got tired of it and sent them all back home. So there were waves of soldiers and officers being sent back to Russia because of the way some of them behaved at Nuremberg. Some of you may have seen the film Judgment at Nuremberg about the judge's trial. It was one of the great classical films. I'm sure the majority of you have had a chance to see it and rerun it. And I think it was a good film because it expressed many of the issues that we've been discussing, many of the dilemmas, and it was done by top-flight actors. However, there was an aspect of that in that film that was pure Hollywood that would not have happened, namely that Marlene Dietrich played the part of the owner of a house that was occupied by one of the judges, played by Spencer Tracy, and Marlene Dietrich would come to the house and reclaim some of her possessions, and in the process there would be conversations between Marlene Dietrich and Spencer Tracy, and there was sort of an undertone of a relationship that was not explicit, but was sort of indicated at that time. Now that kind of thing would not have been possible at Nuremberg. There was no fraternization going on at the time.
What do you mean by that kind of thing? I mean, life went on.
Life went on.
You know, people had love affairs, these things continued.
Absolutely, yes, you're right.
So when you say that didn't happen?
That didn't happen. There would be certainly no overt elements of a relationship between the role played by Marlene Dietrich and the role played by Spencer Tracy.
Thank you for the clarification. Yes, over here, gentleman over here. Oh, and then over here, next over here, and then over here. We'll have plenty of questions. We've got plenty of time for questions.
My name is Boyd McCleary. I'm a student of German and the spouse of an interpreter. I have two questions, if I may. The first, can you give us an indication as to whether the defendants had much knowledge of English themselves? What was the standard of English of Göring and Keitel and Jodl and so on, and whether that had any impact on the interpretation that you were doing? Did they sometimes interrupt and say, no, you didn't get that quite right, what I meant was such and such? That's the first question. The second question was, you were operating in a four-language environment. Was there one language which was used initially to translate, to interpret from the German into that language, and then there were relays into the other languages, or did that vary from day to day and interpreter to interpreter?
Well, to answer with your last part of the last question, there were some languages like Polish and others. For example, there were Polish women who were witnesses of atrocities, of various things. Polish was not one of the four main languages at the trial. So this is why there was a two-stage process. There was the same stage that we had for everything else, and then there was the second stage dealt with Polish in and of itself. So this happened in a few rarely used languages, but yet were necessary as part of the proceedings. That was the second part of your question.
What I meant was, if Keitel was speaking in German,
yes,
and there would have been three interpreters, a Russian interpreter, a French interpreter, and an English interpreter. Yeah. Was English taken as the first language and then relayed into the other languages, or was it?
No, this was all simultaneous.
Yeah. And this first question was, did any of the defendants speak English sufficiently to be able to correct any errors they thought you might have made?
Yeah, very, very few. There were a few speakers of English. Rudolf Hess, who parachuted out of an aeroplane and landed in Scotland somewhere and spent the rest of the war in Scotland. He spoke some English. Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, although he was a very poor foreign minister, but among
that's a comment. That's an opinion.
I beg counsel's pardon.
But generally not. Is the answer. Yeah.
There were a few of them who knew some English.
Over here. Thank you. And your question, I'm sure, is going to be prefaced by the confirmation that the lively life of the Grand Hotel has been replicated subsequently.
It's all business now, Philippe, I can tell you that much. I'm Doug Wilson, Foreign Office Legal Director. What a fascinating conversation. Can I squeeze in two very quick questions, if I may? One was just to ask Siegfried if he'd followed much of the developments in international criminal justice that flow directly from Nuremberg, and his impressions of those, and what he makes of the likes of the Yugoslav Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal, the International Criminal Court, and the other courts that have followed in the wake of Nuremberg. And I also, if I may, Philippe, just like to invite you to expand on the story of the cross-examination that you touched on there, because I find it a fascinating story, what little I know of it.
Of Hans Frank?
Exactly, yes. The failed cross-examination of Göring and Maxwell Fyfe and so on. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. It was quite embarrassing. I mean, it was a situation where when we now switch our roles to be commentators and analysts and so on, and also judgmental. So if we look at that, we realize that take somebody like Justice Robert Jackson, who was a member of the United States Supreme Court and was named by President Truman. President Roosevelt had died not long before that. He was named by President Truman. Justice Jackson was to take on as chief prosecutor for the. What happened when to characterize the role that Jackson played? Jackson showed himself to be an extremely talented orator, a great speaker, and a great writer. And very, again, some people might disagree, but and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give a professional opinion. But his opening statement, Justice Jackson's opening statement at Nuremberg, is one of the great legal writings of the 20th century. It was just an extremely impressive presentation.
And you were in the room for that.
I was in the room for that.
And you remember that.
I remember that. It was extremely strong, and I still continue when there's an opportunity from time to time to open the book and read it as an inspiration of a great speech. So that was Jackson. But on the other hand, Jackson did not really do his homework when it dealt with the details and the specifics with the trials. He just didn't do that. He didn't have the patience for that. And frankly, he also used his position, his fame, if you will, to travel in Europe and enjoy himself and have parties and so on. So he made many mistakes. Goering, on the other hand, although Goering in some respects was also a sort of a buffoon, but a very clever buffoon.
You're really hitting out.
That's right. I warned you.
I've had several conversations with Siegfried, and this is violent stuff compared to what I'm used to. That's right. A buffoon.
Yeah. Well, to give you an example of terminology, and I don't remember the details anymore, we talk about the clearance of the River Rhine. And clearance was interpreted by the population of Rhineland, having to do, whereas in actual fact it had to do with an engineering challenge of the River Rhine. In other words, entirely two different kinds of things. And who pointed that out? That immediately it was Goering. In other words, Goering pointed out several mistakes, made by Jackson, because Jackson did not do his sufficient homework to be a master of all the details. But the man who did repair some of the damage that Jackson was done was an Englishman, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe.
Well, maybe a Scotsman even.
So,
I see David Edward. One has to be very careful these days.
well, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe repaired some of the damage that Jackson had done.
Yeah. There's there was a second question to which we'll come into a moment, but just to say, in response to that, I came across, I was given access to Lord Justice Lawrence, who was the presiding judge at Nuremberg, and I think by all accounts did an extraordinary job. Yes. Was married, and his wife Marjorie attended the entire trial, and Marjorie kept a daily scrapbook, which is now kept in 4 very large volumes in a house in Wiltshire where Sir Geoffrey Lawrence lived until he died, and then it passed down the family. And I was invited by Geoffrey Lawrence's son, before he passed away recently, very famous horse racing commentator, to come and inspect the scrapbooks, which was a fascinating experience, because what would happen was that every day the wife of the presiding judge would, take bits of paper from her husband's desk and stick them into the scrapbook. Numerous references to passionate haystacks. They were all very interested in the lady who we were introduced to at the beginning. But one of the things that was copied in and stuck in its entirety was the full article written by Janet Flanner in the New Yorker magazine. The original copy is in, someone had torn it out, stuck it into the scrapbook, and this is a vicious attack by probably the single best journalist I've read who was in the courtroom, Janet Flanner for the New Yorker, on how useless Robert Jackson was. Now, apparently, Robert Jackson read this and was devastated because it went all around the United States. So this had a very big impact on his reputation And that document is publicly available and is a line-by-line explanation that confirms what Siegfried has said. But you were asked a second question about your feelings to the developments of international criminal justice. We're going to hear shortly about the ICTY. But as all roads lead to Nuremberg. Looking back, do you look with pride on what is happening now or with concern?
Well, I think both pride and concern, because just because a policy does not work or a legal approach does not work, that does not necessarily mean that it is wrong. In other words, Nuremberg created a structure, a road, a path towards the rule of law, towards the rule of international law. So from that point of view, for the 20th century, it made an extremely important contribution that has to do with guilt, it has to do with the acceptance of responsibility. And so that in other words, Nuremberg is a pathway to international morality, and that needs to be understood. And because international morality is not accepted and is not practiced as it should be, does not mean that the principle in and of itself is wrong. The principle in and of itself is a strong and powerful instrument for international morality. The fact that it is abused is regretful, but that does not change anything about the important framework of international law that Nuremberg provided.
There were, there's a lady here.
My name is this working? Yes. My name is Sirpa Lehtonen, and I'm a staff interpreter with the European Commission in the Finnish booth. And I'm also a vice president of AIIC. And first of all, I'd like to say it's so fascinating and moving to be here and to hear you speak about your experiences and your work at the Nuremberg trials, of which I've been reading ever since I was a student, and it's something that comes up always in the profession. We all look back and hear about it, and to see you here tonight is absolutely unforgettable. But I'd like to ask you a question, a very technical question actually, because if I think of how we work at the European Union today, there are more than 500 staff interpreters just at the Commission where I work, and we've got very clearly regulated working hours. And I saw there that, for instance, in that one interrogation, you were doing consecutive and you were on your own for about 2 hours. What about simultaneous? How long stretches were you expected to work for on your own? And also, just sort of wondering, I can entirely relate to what you say, that you didn't think you didn't pass judgment on the people you were working with. It must have been so intense to enter those trials without preparation, and I mean, not the sort of preparation at least that we have these days. People spend a year or 2 years doing a master's in interpreting before they are allowed to start interpreting in real life situations, and you were just sort of recruited and you had to start working right away. So I can understand that it must have been so intense that you didn't have time to think about what was going on in order to pass judgment or have personal opinions. But did it come back to you later? Because you must have witnessed details of the Shoah. Did they?
So that in detail, but I can just say, generally speaking, in my case, as a personal experience, I now find myself going to my personal library and rereading matters that I had not looked at, had not reread for a long time. In other words, I'm becoming more interested and more aware of what has happened than it had been before.
And what about the question of how long were your interpretation sessions?
Usually they were much longer than now. They were something like 40 or 45 minutes, which is very long. Ideal right now, I think the practice is no more than half an hour.
Okay, let's move on, because we're about to run out of time, and I do want to. There's a gentleman here, and then if there's anyone at the back, if you could stick your hand up now so that I can just see it. Okay, if you could get that person afterwards.
Hello, I'm Paul Kay. I'm a translator at the European Commission. It's a privilege to come and listen to your story. I wondered what the status of interpreters was at the court. We heard earlier that court interpreters in this country, their status is starting to be eroded at international tribunals and international organisations. Often they're behind glass, not seen, not noticed, not thought about. You were a lot more visible there. How were you perceived by the other actors in the court, the lawyers, the defendants, the judges and so on? And did that change over the 4 years that you were there? How were you perceived at the start, and because it was a novelty, and then at the end of the process, did people's view of you change?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I managed, talk to about myself first. I made many friends, and some very strong friendships that lasted for a long time. As I said, unfortunately, some of those friends are no longer alive because they were much older than I, when I was at Nuremberg. So what, in response to your question, indeed, there was mutual civility. We were not only civil to one another, but also many friendships, especially among court reporters, among interpreters for other languages. So there was strong friendships built, and there was also quite a bit of time given for recreation. For example, in the winter, we went skiing a great deal, and were able to take long weekends when the court was not in session and enjoy the snow in the Alps. In the summer, we would go to the Salzburg music festivals and enjoy wonderful music. In other words, there were things, and the people, we went there very often in groups when there would be 3 or 4 or 5, and we come from different professional backgrounds, but we became very good friends. So I look back to this cultural, social aspect of friendship in Nuremberg with a great deal of fondness. It made an impression on me, it still makes an impression, that these were figures in one's life that you enjoyed, that you related to, that you admired very often. So the answer to your question, indeed positive. There were good friendships, and it was an important time for us.
And you felt professionally respected?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, just these
one of those
questions
things led to a marriage.
It did indeed.
Kathleen Kennedy, can I just ask you a very quick question? There was a David Irving case where the judge, after the case, actually had to take a number of months off because he was so traumatized by what had happened. How did you feel at the end of your 4 years?
Whether I was traumatized?
Yes.
Well, I think I go back to our session here from the very beginning, where I made the point that obviously the things that we saw were shocking, but they could not be translated into feelings about what was going on, because we were not in a position to feel one way or another. We're in a position to be professional linguists.
And then, well, we'll take gentleman over there and then this lady over here, and then we're going to bring this part of the evening, I think, to a halt to allow you to rest and have a glass of water.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Ivan Volodin. I come from the Russian Embassy. I really want to thank the organizers and you, of course, for this fascinating event. I want to ask you about the Soviet colleagues of yours. What kind of, I mean, apart from alcohol, what kind of environment was there in the courtroom and elsewhere with them? Was it an atmosphere of Cold War and an Iron Curtain going down, or was it a more friendly and cooperative atmosphere?
Very important question. I'm glad you brought that up, because the war ended in 1945. World War II ended in 1945. And the reason it was so important to have the media represented, because the whole world was interested in what was going on at Nuremberg. It was very often front page coming from the testimony. So So that had a very important impact. Now, I forgot about the second part of your question.
The gentleman who asked the question is from the Russian embassy here, and is just interested in the way in which that particular moment, as the Iron Curtain was coming down, did global, perhaps if I paraphrase, did global politics enter into the processes in some way?
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question. 1945, World War II ended. 1946, the beginning really of the Cold War. The Cold War in the US and Western Europe's relationship to the Soviet Union. During the Cold War period, and as the Cold War became more and more intense with the Berlin airlift and these things that happened at that time, something strange happened, namely that for the United States, the Nuremberg trials in some ways became an embarrassment. Why did it become an embarrassment? Because the political urgency had to deal with the threat of Cold War of the Soviet Union, and the Nuremberg trials interfered with the need of West Germany and the need of NATO to be embraced fondly to go forward in the Cold War situation where the Soviet Union represented a big challenge to the United States.
So it did affect the conduct of the process.
Absolutely, yeah. And it was often quite a bitter thing. After Justice Jackson, the following chief prosecutor, was a man I respected a great deal and became in a way a friend. He visited me once in Hawaii. General Telford Taylor, who was a fine lawyer, was also a professor of law at Columbia University, and so on. And he and many others and his colleagues were quite upset that all of the work they felt that was done by the prosecution during that period of Cold War, in a sense, a lot of it was lost because they did not get the cooperation from Washington that they should have. People were sentenced to life imprisonment and were let out after 1 year or even less than a year. So in other words, it became a political hot potato, so to speak.
And just a chance here for one final question over here before we bring this part of the evening to a close.
Okay, my name is Elena and come from AIIC, Portugal. I'm very happy to be here, and I think this is a unique event, so I thank AIIC for organizing it. My question was, I have read that it wasn't your case, but in some cases, some of the interpreters broke down and could no longer work. Is that true, or
they could no longer work?
They could no longer work emotionally. They had an emotional breakdown, and they had to be moved to the translation section, right, rather than continue interpreting. That was my question.
Yeah, in some cases we had situations where interpreters just felt they were not up to it anymore and asked to be relieved and went into translation work and went into other kind of work. That's very true.
And was that connected, if I've understood your question, to and it relates to an earlier question, to the sheer scale of the horror that they were being exposed to? I mean,
well, it may have related to the horror, but more importantly, there may have been a sense of overall fatigue of not able to, to carry on anymore.
The level of intensity was so great.
Was great.
Yeah.
It also, in language again, there's partly a humorous aspect to it. We had a simultaneous interpreter, a very talented lady who was a professional librarian late in her career. She passed away about a year ago, Virginia von Schoen. She was very beautiful lady, very prim, very proper, very elegant in so many ways. She was in a situation. I was a monitor of the simultaneous interpreting scene. She was on the English microphone, and a word came up that she could not bring herself to pronounce, because it was so vulgar that she did not want to pronounce a vulgarity into that open courtroom. So what happened is she came to a dead stop. I mean, she came all the way up to that word, and when that word was to be pronounced, she stopped. She just couldn't do it. I was the monitor at the time, and I realized that there was a breakdown, that she had stopped, and she wouldn't pronounce that word. So I took the microphone from her and used it. Used it, and in fact made it worse than it been before. On that note of levity, we might adjourn.
I mean, there is the obvious question, which I will not put, as to what the word might have been.
Thank you.
But let's leave that for private conversation. Look, I mean, a number of you have mentioned it. This has been really unique. A number of people have said this. It's been beyond unique, actually. I mean, to sit with someone who has sat in an interrogation booth with Hermann Goering and Hans Frank, who sat in that courtroom and who has, you know, lived a long and rich and wonderful life, and come now with his wonderful wife to London to share this with us at an age where these things are not easy to travel so far. I think we're all overwhelmed by a certain emotion that you have been willing to give us your time in this way. I think I speak for everyone here to express the biggest possible thank you to you for coming and for